29th, 1929, the day the stock market crashed. This is what it looks like today. 3 automobiles right here. A 1928 Chevy, a 28 Ford, and a 28 Essex touring car.
Oh, it was terrible. It went down pretty suddenly. I think the machinery collapsed within it from up north of Winnetka down to Evanston. There was wreckage all over the place.
It was the 1st of March, 1944, when our pilot took a swim in Lake Michigan, just off of Toohey, 20-some miles out on the lake. It was actually found by a group that was doing some salvage work, and they sold the airplane to us when we started the restoration.
Chicago has collected many colorful names over the years. Names like the Windy City, City of Big Shoulders, Hog Butcher to the World. But it is yet to be given one moniker that it richly deserves. Chicago, shipwreck capital of the Great Lakes. Because here, just off the shores of our city, are dozens of sunken vessels dating back to the early 1800s. And let's not forget the planes, trains, and automobiles, and yes, even a submarine that can be found in this not-so-briny deep.
Hi, I'm your host, Will Klinger. Behind each of those shipwrecks out there is a fascinating piece of history. Tonight on the Wild Chronicles, we'll explore the waters off Chicago's coast and reveal stories of heroism, of survival, and sometimes of tragic loss.
Of the thousands of pleasure boaters that motor, sail, and paddle off Chicago's coast every summer, not many realize that underneath them are the remains of over 100 vessels that once plied these same waters, not for pleasure, but for profit. The Chicago of the 18 and early 1900s was a thriving seaport, a center of commerce due to its strategic location on the Great Lakes. There was money to be made transporting cargo and passengers to and from the city, but it wasn't an easy or particularly safe way to earn a living. The weather on Lake Michigan could be treacherous, with waves as high as any oceans that come in quicker succession. So that an infamous Great Lakes northeaster, or a sudden and ferocious squall, was capable of battering a boat into submission and sending it to the bottom, often before help could arrive. 1883 was a particularly bad year to find yourself in a boat on Lake Michigan. 100 ships were lost at sea, more than 200 lives lost with them. On May 20th, an unusually ugly storm was raging off Chicago's shores, with winds up to 120 miles per hour. And many vessels in the area suffered damage, but the worst victim of the weather was a 201-foot cargo schooner christened the Wells Burt. Carrying coal from Wisconsin to the furnaces of Chicago, it foundered and sank just 3 miles off Evanston. All 11 on board, including the captain's young son, were drowned, and only one body was ever found. On a summer day 114 years later, we boarded a dive boat headed for Evanston and the remains of the Wells Burt. Joining us were members of the Underwater Archaeological Society of Chicago, whose purpose it is to make a lasting record of this and other shipwrecks in Lake Michigan.
Wrecks that sank 50 to 200 years ago, we take a picture of them in the late 1900s so that archaeologists or whoever's interested can look at a picture of the way these old wood boats looked 100 years after they sank. You look at a lot of the sailboats around Chicago nowadays, they're average 25 to 50 feet, and this is a 200-foot three-masted schooner. It took 6 hours to put the sails up. It went almost 18 miles an hour. This thing, presently, as it sits on the bottom, is holding a load of 1,500 tons of coal.
Now, the question's got to be asked, the weather was so bad, why did the boat even take off for their destination?
Their weather predictions were made by the captain. There was no weather service, and incidentally, that's what started the weather service, is ships having a problem on the Great Lakes.
How many wrecks are there off the coast of Chicago?
A wild guess is about 8,000 wrecks in the Great Lakes, 3,000 wrecks in Lake Michigan, and about 300 wrecks off Chicago.
How many have been discovered?
There's about 25 to 35 wrecks that have been discovered. Well,
so there's a lot of wrecks out there that nobody's ever seen.
Oh, absolutely. Most of them
This is one of the best preserved wrecks in this area, and therefore one of the most popular dive sites in this area as well.
We'll be anchoring off the bow, and when we descend on the bow, we'll find the anchor capstan is still in place. Coming aft of the capstan, we'll be visiting some of the cargo hatches. Some of those we'll be able to penetrate into and swim underneath the decking. About a third of the decking is still in place on this, which is very unique for shipwrecks in this area.
Divers who descend on the Wells Burt are greeted by a marker put there by the Underwater Archaeological Society, warning them to take only pictures, leave only bubbles. We made our way down a rope tied to the bow of the wreck, and soon discovered that some areas of the deck were more intact than others. Proceeding along the starboard side, we discovered a row of deadeyes, wooden pulley-like contraptions that got their name from their resemblance to a human skull. We found a neatly carved hole where one of the great masts had been, and just beyond it, a wooden block that had once held the schooner's steering wheel. Under the deck, somewhere beneath the sand, lies the 1,500 tons of coal that had been the Wells Burt's cargo on the day it sank.
Not a bad dive.
It was a good dive. This is one of the most intact wrecks we have around Chicago, and we'd like to keep it that way. I haven't seen any theft on this boat in a long time, and I'm pretty impressed with that.
I'm impressed with the fact that you're drinking a Jolt Cola.
It's the breakfast of
It's the breakfast of a man with rubber nipples, apparently.
While the Wells Burt may be the most well-preserved shipwreck in the area, there are others that hold just as much fascination for both divers and historians. One in particular has a cargo still on board as unique as the story of its sinking. The SS Wisconsin was a steamer carrying passengers and cargo from Chicago to Milwaukee when it sank just off Kenosha in a heavy storm on October 29, 1929. If that date sounds familiar, it should. It's the same day the stock market crash brought the Roaring Twenties to a screeching halt. The day before, Captain Dougal Morrison had decided to set sail despite the gathering storm on Lake Michigan. He had reason to be confident. The Wisconsin, 215 feet long and 1,181 tons, was considered the sturdiest ship on the Great Lakes. And even though another ship, the railcar ferry Milwaukee, had gone down just a week before in a similar storm, Morrison felt sure he could deliver his passengers and cargo safely. Almost immediately after leaving the safety of Chicago's harbor, though, the Wisconsin began to be pounded by waves that reached over 30 feet high. A few hours later, the ship began taking on water from a leak in the cargo deck. By 2:15 in the morning, the situation had become dire, and Captain Morrison sent out the following distress call. Due to sink any time now. For God's sake, send help. That help came too late for the Wisconsin and the 16 men who perished. Among that number was Captain Morrison, who was pulled from the wreckage bleeding and unconscious, having refused to board the available lifeboats. As legend has it, once they got him to shore, Morrison miraculously recovered and began moving about, thanking those that had helped in the rescue of the 58 survivors. This done, he collapsed again and was dead within the hour. In 1929, Homer Bishop was a Kenosha high school student. On the day of the Wisconsin disaster, his Boy Scout troop was urgently requested to leave class and come down to the beach to comb the shoreline, looking for either survivors or bodies.
We started south from this point to patrol the beach. We got down past Winthrop Harbor, getting back sometime very early in the morning. It took us a good piece of the night with only flashlights to show where we were going. We didn't find any bodies, but we found a lot of junk, pieces of wood, broken oars, life vests, just junk. That was a long, lonely night. If we'd have found a body, I don't know what we would have done.
After initial attempts to salvage the vessel from the bottom of Lake Michigan failed, the SS Wisconsin was left to rest peacefully in its watery grave. It wasn't until 1962 that the wreck was rediscovered using sonar equipment by a pair of industrious divers. Since then, many underwater explorers have made it their destination, but none so persistently as one Jim Herbersky. He has made more than 1,000 dives on the Wisconsin over the last 20 years. and we thought that would make him a perfect guide to its murky resting place.
It's 4.7 miles from here, 60 degrees straight out. It's sitting in 128 feet of water.
Well, let's fire this baby up and get going.
Okay.
Captain, just how are we going to find this treasure of the deep anyway?
Well, we're going to go out on the Loran, and I have permanent lines tied right to the wreck. They're gallon milk jugs. 50, 60 years ago, any evening you could come down on the lake, and it would just be solid boats on the lake because the Midwest was built by the commerce on the lakes.
Yeah.
That's why there's thousands of ships laying on the bottom of these lakes. There it is. This is a drawing of the Wisconsin before it went down. All the upper works are gone. This is what it looks like today. All of the top cabins are gone, but all these little dark holes is where you can drop into the ship, and that's where all the artifacts are. There's also 3 automobiles right here, a 1928 Chevy, a 28 Ford, and a 28 Essex touring car.
This is the camera, I'm guessing.
Well, it's basically a video recorder, kind of like you know, your basic household handy cam, and it fits in its own little submarine.
I just want you to make me look good, Vic.
There's not enough camera in the world, Will.
How you been?
At 128 feet down with a bottom temperature in the mid-40s, the Wisconsin is a difficult dive, but it quickly becomes worthwhile once you've set eyes on the ship's massive remains. 70 years at the bottom of Lake Michigan have taken away most of the upper works and covered the wreck with a thick layer of silt. But there is much that is strangely unaltered. It's not hard to imagine what the Wisconsin must have looked like in the days when it was inhabited by more than a stray fish. In 1987, a law was passed that makes it illegal to remove mementos from a sunken ship. Any artifacts found on board must be left behind. That would include the 1920s automobiles still parked on the Wisconsin's lower deck.
About 45 degrees down there, a little nippy.
Once back on shore, Jim took us back to his place to show us some of the treasures he had salvaged from the bowels of the Wisconsin.
These have come in probably from the mid-70s to the mid-80s, and then after the law was enacted, I respect the law and I quit removing the artifacts. What I have here is a 1928 Pond's Ladies Cream. There's a case of them down there.
Give me a whiff.
You can still smell the ponds.
Yeah.
Here's vanishing cream, toothpaste.
This looks like a razor.
Yeah. Lincoln Logs, there's 2 cases of them. I think I have about 8 of them I brought up.
This is the china from the boat. This says this says Goodrich steamship line.
Steamship line, right.
It's amazing how this stuff is so well preserved.
Some of it I've cleaned up. This is what it looks like if it's not cleaned. It'll come up like pretty much looking like this or this here. It's buried in silt. It's not a, pleasant experience, but if you're 2 or 3 decks down, you have 2 or 3 ceilings, so you have to go in the way you come out. Yeah. And it's pitch black. I mean, if you shut off your light, it's black like you've never seen. Here's a pewter candy dish.
Yeah.
And the pewter in the old days was so...
Look at that.
It's just almost lead. This is almost pure lead. This was quite unique. I found this inside a ship, and on the top where it was curved, it was a picture of a man standing next to a big horse. But anyway, when we got into the boat, I opened it up. It opens up, there's a hinge.
There's a little mirror.
There's a mirror. You know what was inside here?
I'm going to guess it was a vanity of some kind, a little pouch.
Prophylactic. And the man standing next to the big horse?
Trojan.
Trojan.
Of the many unusual things to be found on the bottom of Lake Michigan, few can rival the World War II fighter planes that ended up there in the early 1940s. You see, in order to qualify naval pilots for carrier duty for the war in the Pacific, the Naval Air Station at Glenview converted a pair of passenger steamers into aircraft carriers and set them out on Lake Michigan. The pilots in training would have to make 8 landings and takeoffs, and inevitably, accidents happened. The often tricky Lake Michigan winds swirling over a rolling deck sometimes prove too challenging for the novices in the cockpit. They would come in too fast or too far to one side, or occasionally miss the deck altogether. The end result was that close to 200 fighter planes wound up sleeping with the fishes. For several decades, this underwater squadron lay undisturbed on the bottom of the lake. And it wasn't until the 1980s that new technology enabled interested parties to locate and begin to salvage some of these long-lost aircraft. Most of the recovered planes have been cleaned up and put in museums. But we got word that a pair of intrepid enthusiasts had taken things one step further.
Hey, guys. This is your plane, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Can you tell us how you came to own it?
Well, Jim called me on a December day in 1991 and said, "You wouldn't believe it, but I have an opportunity to buy an airplane that spent 48 years at the bottom of the lake. What do you think?" And I said, "I don't know, Jim."
Where was it exactly?
It was just off of Toohey, 20-some miles out on the lake. And I didn't know much about this particular airplane. I called him to see if he'd be interested. And then Dick did a little quick research and called me back and says, "Are you sure that's an F4F-3?" Because he said, that's a very rare airplane.
The fuselage is 97% original. If you look at the plexiglass that the pilot looks out of, that's all original. When it came up, the tires had air in it. We took the battery out and put electrolyte in it, and it took a charge. It's still charged up today. It had 450 caliber machine guns.
It is the only plane that has been taken off the bottom of a lake and now flies, correct?
A number were retrieved and are now in museums, but there are only 2 that are actually back in the air again.
Was this plane landing or taking off when it crashed?
Taking off. The 1st of March, 1944, when our pilot took a swim in Lake Michigan.
It was a guy named Ensign Forsberg.
John Forsberg, that's right. The engine was failing as it was rolling down the deck. He knew that. But they had given him the wind-up signal and the go signal, and being a naval flight officer, he was told to go, he went. And the airplane just didn't have enough horsepower to maintain flying speed, and it just sort of settled into the water about 300 yards ahead of the ship.
And then the ship was bearing down on it.
That's right.
How did Forsberg escape death?
Well, he said he took his time unharnessing. He finally got out in the wing, and then he realized, he looked over his shoulder, and there was the bow of the ship coming right at him. He jumped in the water and back paddled, and he said he just barely missed the port side paddle wheel by about 10 feet.
The Navy claimed that it was pilot error.
Well, that's what they claimed. But because the engine wasn't developing full power on takeoff.
And he disputed, obviously, the findings that he was to blame, and in fact, when they found it at the bottom, there was evidence that he was correct.
We actually saw some footage of a camera inside the airplane at 200 feet under the water, and very obviously the throttle was full forward. So he was vindicated after 47 years later, after he crashed it. Dick finally found the pilot one day, and we'd been looking on the West Coast and the East Coast and Florida, and we're kind of afraid maybe we wouldn't be able to find him. And then Dick called me one day and said, I could really hear the excitement in his voice. He said, "We found the pilot." And I said, "You're kidding." He said, "No, guess where he lives?" I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Arlington Heights." So,
sadly, he was quite ill and died that same year. But we did have a chance to take him up to where the airplane was restored, and he had a chance to sit in the cockpit again. And the first thing he did when he saw it, he says, "Boys," he said, "it didn't look this nice when I last flew it." Look at that, no runway at all.
Some 20 years after those World War II planes found their way to the bottom of the lake, they would be joined there by a much larger aircraft. On a clear summer evening in 1965, United Airlines Flight 389 on approach to O'Hare crashed into Lake Michigan 7 miles east of Highland Park. The fiery explosion on impact was seen and heard as far away as North Avenue Beach. None of the 30 passengers and crew survived, and while most of the wreckage and all of the bodies were eventually recovered by salvage divers, no cause for the crash was ever determined. The wreck of the Lady Elgin off Waukegan in 1860 involved a dramatic collision, a heroic rescue effort, and a staggering loss of life. Nearly 300 of the 400 people on board perished in the disaster, and the ferocity of the storm that night carried some of the bodies and wreckage as far away as Indiana. Some historians would eventually refer to the Lady Elgin as the Titanic of the Great Lakes. The trip had begun with a convivial atmosphere on board. The Irish Union Guard, a pre-Civil War militia from Milwaukee, had chartered the Lady Elgin for a trip to Chicago to attend a political rally that had featured a speech by presidential candidate Stephen Douglas. After the festivities, they had returned to the ship along with some fellow revelers from Chicago, a number of whom, in their inebriated state, failed to disembark before the Lady Elgin set sail at 11:30 that evening. It was an oversight they would soon regret. For the harrowing story of what happened next, we went to Lighthouse Beach in Evanston to meet Bob Gadboy, a member of the Underwater Archaeological Society and the first professional cameraman to record video of the Lady Elgin's ghostly remains.
We're here because this is one of the sites of heroism and loss of life from the Lady Elgin. People and debris were being washed ashore, and the townspeople were being alerted that something terrible had happened, and among those that got the word was a student by the name of Edward Spencer. So he came running up to this point to see what he could do to help save lives.
What he did was swim out into the pounding surf with its dangerous undertow and drag as many people as he could back to safety. By the time he finally collapsed from exhaustion, Spencer had saved 18 lives.
After all this was done, he was delirious. It was just took everything out of him. As I understand it, he wasn't the same person after that.
How did the boat go down? It wasn't the stormy weather.
No, the boat was holding its own. It was doing fine. But along in the night came this schooner called the Augusta and rammed right into its side. It speared into the hull. It held there being speared. And as the Lady Elgin was going forward, the Augusta swung about toward the rear,
making the hole bigger.
And then finally broke away and left this open, gaping hole.
Then that boat just simply sailed away.
Their claim was that they thought the Lady Elgin was doing okay, and they thought they were sinking.
Meanwhile, the Lady Elgin sank rather quickly, and
it went down pretty suddenly. I think the machinery collapsed within it. But before that, the crew was scrambling to throw things overboard and chop up wood so that they could get some floating debris in the water for people to hang on to.
But there was worse danger waiting for them and the others that had stayed alive up till now. For as they approached land, a stone's throw from safety, they could see enormous waves crashing with deadly force against the rocky bluffs.
It was very wild and rugged along this area. It wasn't groomed at all. I mean, 12-foot waves, these people were washed ashore and crushed against rocks and dashed against hard objects.
After surviving a sinking ship and several hours in bone-chilling waters, it was a cruel injustice that so many of the Lady Elgin's passengers and crew would lose their lives within 20 yards of shore.
Many of these wrecks are known when they've gone down. They salvage what they can, and then they forget about them. Mm-hmm. And so many years go by, and then the interest is renewed on these things, and people say, wish I knew where the Lady Elgin was.
It wasn't until 1989, 129 years after it sank, that the remains of the Lady Elgin were finally discovered. A professional marine salver named Harry Zeik found it in 50 feet of water about 10 miles off Waukegan, and soon had recovered many artifacts, including some of the Irish Union Guard's pre-Civil War muskets. In 1992, 3 years after the Lady Elgin was discovered, the Underwater Archaeological Society dove in the boat to do a survey. What did you find down there?
Initially, we found the boiler section and little else. I wish I could tell you that it was a totally intact wreck down there and you could inspect every piece of it, but you understand, they started chopping it apart, and what they didn't do, the surf did. This wreck was totally scattered. You can see all this planking from the bow, and you can see the anchor chain running around underneath it and extending way out beyond that and wrapped around a rock underwater, a huge rock, as a matter of fact. What really clinched it for me was this archway. It looks exactly underwater as it does in this photo. I said, that's got to be it.
I see you've got the shipwrecks of the Great Lakes here on your shirt, and yet the Lady Elgin is not on here. Was this a worse disaster than the Edmund Fitzgerald, which I see here on your shirt?
Oh, yeah. Edmund Fitzgerald, 29 people. That was it.
29 people, and this had more than 300.
More than 300.
Well, you'd think they'd have a song about this boat.
They do. Lost on the Lady Elgin, sleeping to wake no more, numbered in that 300 who failed to reach the shore.
The Lady Elgin story continues to this day. Harry Zeik wants to raise the remains he discovered and build a museum around it, but the state of Illinois has claimed ownership and insists that it stay where it is. When we last checked, they were still in court. And there is talk of raising a different vessel that lies off Chicago's shores. A very different vessel. It's a German submarine from World War I. In 1919, this UC-97 mine-laying sub was captured by American forces and hauled back to the States. After the war, it was shuttled around the Great Lakes as a tourist attraction, and it ended up being docked at Navy Pier. But the Treaty of Versailles mandated that any captured armaments had to be destroyed by the summer of 1921. So at the appointed time, it was towed out into Lake Michigan to become the target of the naval training gunboat called the USS Wilmette, though it hadn't always gone by that name. It had once been an excursion boat known as the Eastland, but on July 24th, 1915, it tipped over at the Clark Street dock. Overloaded with passengers and with too little ballast, it capsized onto its port side, pitching hundreds of people into the river and trapping hundreds more below deck. When all the bodies were counted, 825 people had lost their lives. Now, resurrected as the Wilmette, the gunboat successfully shelled its target, and the UC-97 sank without a trace. In 1992, the A&T Recovery Company, which discovered more than a dozen other wrecks in Lake Michigan, was the first to find and record this video of the UC-97. The German sub now sits in mud under 250 feet of water, some 13 miles from downtown Chicago. Whether or not this German submarine or the Lady Elgin are ever returned to the surface, there are hundreds of other vessels at the bottom of Lake Michigan that have yet to even be found. That may soon change with the advent of more sophisticated sonar equipment. But while some of the shipwrecks from the past will be salvaged, chances are they will eventually be replaced by future ships that succumb to the wind and waves off Chicago's shores. For if you think that modern-day shipping is immune to calamity on the Great Lakes, remember that the Edmund Fitzgerald broke in half not in the 1800s, but in 1975. History, whether it's found in books or at the bottom of Lake Michigan, has a habit of repeating itself.